Making a follow-up to Crisis on Infinite Earths wasn't attempted for over 20 years. So, how did Infinite Crisis do it so well? Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Geoff Johns and illustrated by Phil Jimenez, Jerry Ordway, George Perez, and Ivan Rice. The first issue of Infinite Crisis was published by DC Comics in December of 2005, with the 7th and final issue being released in June of 2006. And the DC universe is tearing itself apart. Between a rising of the League of Supervillains, OMAC hunting metahumans, and the Justice League dividing, things aren't looking great. But with the remaining heroes of the multiverse hatching a plan, there may still be a chance to save everything that we know. But what if despite that, the universe still can't be saved? And what if those trying to help us are the ones that we should fear the most? Now, fair warning, if you really want to enjoy Infinite Crisis, you need to read most of the prologue. Admittedly, there was still some that are skimmed, but bare minimum you have to read Superman's Sacrifice, Infinite Crisis Prologue, and JLA Crisis of Conscience. The first time that I read this when I was 12, and it was like the 4th DC book that I ever read, I did not have a clue what was happening. But that's not to say that all of the prologue is written to the same standard, and the 4 Infinite Crisis specific tie-ins, and yeah, I'm talking about OMAC, Villains United, Day of Vengeance, and Ran Thanagar War, and fair warning, no idea if I pronounced that right. All of these could have benefited from being at least 3 issues shorter, but then again, I know I am a little bit impatient, which might have impacted my experience, and fair warning if you are too, the main Infinite Crisis storyline doesn't kick in until around about the 1000-page mark. However, I can't imagine revisiting this event without going back to that prelude and getting the full experience. It's why I would recommend picking up the omnibus, because it does have the correct mapping, and also because you can get it for a little bit cheaper, and that's only with the discount codes that we've got from the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. But something I just have to get out there, by God, what an enjoyable event this is. I feel like whenever I hear people writing off all events in future and saying the crap and not worth the time, I can point to Infinite Crisis because it just did so much right. The best part about this, and what a title of this magnitude needed, was that sense of scale. It really couldn't afford to be one of those, oh, the world's ending, but we're only going to focus on 3 characters. And despite the fact that I said you need to read the prologue, once the main event kicks off, you don't really need much else. It's kind of almost like the exact opposite of what I said about Flashpoint. And in all honesty, that's something that I loved about this. Because there was just so much going on in those main 7 issues, but at the same time, it never felt like there was too much to the point where you couldn't follow what was happening. And that sense of scale was ever present, even in those issues where it might have just followed a few stories. It knew how to remind you that there was this constant threat looming in the background. And despite that, and probably more impressively, it was still really easy to follow what was going on. You know, as long as I was paying attention. And in a weird way, this might sound like a backhanded compliment, but I have to give Infinite Crisis praise for that, because it did manage to keep me focused. There was rarely a moment where I started to zone out, which I thought might have been a problem because it was something that cropped up during the prelude. And I also remember that that was a problem that I had with the original Crisis on Infinite Earths when I reviewed it last year, but this felt way more concentrated, more direct in its purpose, and because of that, it kept a far greater pace that it managed to maintain throughout the entire series. And at the same time, it never forgot to include specific character moments. And that's something that other events can often forget to find time for, because you've got all the universe spanning stuff going on. And again, it is greatly assisted by the prelude, because it gave me a great insight into where all the big players were at before we got into this. But even during the event, a lot of the characters got time to continue their own story, which is great because it didn't feel like every character just paused their life for this event to happen. Even though, in all honesty, if the sky was red and it looked like the universe was being destroyed, I'd probably put a few things on hold. One obvious example of how the characters are handled in this is Booster Gold. Now, I'm going to be a bit biased towards him because 52 for the last few weeks has already been my cardio read before I even started reading Infinite Crisis again. I know, dumb mistake. But Booster was an integral part of this experience, even if he wasn't at the forefront of the fight. I really like it when events manage to have a side plot going on that still feels like it's contributing to the story, and on top of that, and him going through the grieving process for Ted, his time in this event was one of the highlights for me. And that side quest that I spoke about revolved around Jaime becoming the Blue Beetle. And I get that this omnibus doesn't include absolutely everything, but it still felt like there were a few key moments missing, and it's especially because of him. We go from a building falling down and Jaime picking up the scarab to it somehow being fused to his spine, and he doesn't seem freaked out by that. And then he meets Batman once and he's just fully into being Blue Beetle, and he's venturing off into space to to fight the battle, and he also knows that he's got a beef with Guy Gardner. It's just a good job that I still remember my script from my Who is Blue Beetle video. I also would have been worried that I skipped over a few pages, and especially considering that this is his big debut in the title that's, let's be honest, pretty much guaranteed to be read by every DC reader that year. I have to say, unfortunately, Jaime didn't leave much of an impression on me, and the only reason I found his inclusion interesting was because of the way Booster handled it. And DC's big three get a lot of attention in this, but not to the level where it feels like we've got the Trinity and then just everyone else. And what I found most interesting is that Infinite Crisis had me thinking back on Doomsday Clock, which I haven't really done since I reviewed it, but it's only because Superman is really at the core of this. Especially so because there's two of him, and that should go without saying because it would have felt odd if he hadn't been. And sure, seeing him fighting to save the universe is always great to see, but Johns added a really unique layer in early. I think it might even be the first scene, and it's when Batman says that the last time Superman inspired anybody was when he died. Bit harsh, but you can see that repeating through Clark's head throughout the entire event, especially when he's looking at the frame covers at the Daily Planet, or when he's being told how great Earth 2 is compared to the Earth that he saves. And at the same time, what Bruce said didn't force him to change who he is, and that's despite the fact that he clearly hit a nerve. And if anything, I felt that was more a reflection on how the comic world views Superman more than anything to do with his character changing. The juxtaposition between Earth 2 and regular Superman was also fun to watch unfold, even if I did drastically prefer the younger Clark. And it made me realise that even though he is still the archetypal hero, he has still changed and evolved in many ways, because the regular Clark didn't feel dated in comparison to his alternate universe self. And it almost feels like this was a commentary directly targeted at people who thought that Superman was just a hero from a bygone time, and it just really made me appreciate his character more. And there's always a reason why he's at the centre of these types of stories. However, I don't feel Batman and Wonder Woman got as much focus in the main event, which is a little bit disappointing. Don't get me wrong, there's still enough going on that I don't feel like the story was lacking because they weren't involved as much, but considering the book opens and closes with the Trinity, Diana and Bruce only seem to actually have any development before the event even started. And when they are involved, it does play to the strengths because Bruce is underground for the majority of this story, dealing with the fallout of OMAC and also the arrival of the new Blue Beetle, and I enjoyed those moments where it did play into his paranoia because he was betrayed by the Justice League and he no longer knows who he can trust. But again, the majority of that played out before Infinite Crisis even began, so in the main event we were mostly trying to see him clean up the mess that he started, which was still enjoyable, and I liked the interactions that he did have with OMAC. I just kinda wanted more of it. And there were still a handful of key moments for him, especially in the final issue. There was a scene that I feel I will see again in Final Crisis, along with some other good interactions that he had with other members of the Bat family, but I don't know, he just felt a bit underutilized throughout the rest of this. And again, it kind of ties into what I was saying earlier, that even though it does have a phenomenal pace, it probably could have benefited from another issue or two, which seems to be a theme with Geoff Johns written DC events. And Wonder Woman's one of those characters where the majority of her journey is done in the road to Infinite Crisis than it is in Infinite Crisis itself. But on the plus side, what a journey it is. Superman's Sacrifice I've always said is one of my favourite Wonder Woman books, and it still is today. I love everything about a confrontation with Maxwell Lord and the impact that that has on a public reputation, and it also just kept adding to the discussion the longer the event went on, and we got a chance to see it interact with regular people and them doubt the words that she says. But it's amazing how they found a way to tie that into the speech that she gave Batman at the end. Again, I just wish we could have got more time with it, especially in the middle of the event. But is it just me, or did Batman and Superman seem a little too annoyed at Wonder Woman? It kind of reminded me of that episode of Alan Partridge when he knew he had to fire pretty much all of his staff and was just looking for any reason to be ridiculously annoyed at them. God, I love that show. Like, I get she broke the one rule that they all share, but it's not like she wasn't considering alternatives. And having Clark be so vocally annoyed felt really out of line considering the fact that it's because he was possessed that she had to make this choice. I don't know, if it was me, given the circumstances, I wouldn't be too annoyed at it. I'd probably just let it slide, but I'd tell her not to do it again, which I'm sure will be really intimidating coming from me. I should probably talk about the art because it's a massive part of the reason why this event was so enjoyable. There are some huge names working on this and it feels like each of them represent a different era. So there's a great range of styles, but it also just feels like a passing of the torch. You've got George Perez, who was fundamental to the 80s, and also I did a video talking about his top 5 notable works if you want to know a little bit more about his influence. Jerry Ordway to me is one of those names that represents the 90s. Phil Jimenez really symbolised the early 2000s, and Ivan Reis really hit his stride with Infinite Crisis and what followed after. So as much as only having one artist working on this might have made it feel a bit more linear, having so many different styles, sometimes often being on the same issue with each other, felt like this homage to everything that's come before and after Infinite Crisis. So it was really fantastic to look at. And the best part, despite how different all of their styles are, they all come together nicely and it just feels like one style. You can still pull apart some pages and go, oh, I recognise that Perez would have done this or Ivan would have done that, but fortunately there's no massive jarring changes. It's not like the situation that I had when I reviewed Avengers vs X-Men, and the action in this is some of the best I think you can find in some of these big company-wide events. And I spoke about scale before in terms of the story, but when it comes to the art, it really has it, especially in those final few issues. The space battles feel vast, and there's so much detail there that it feels like there's thousands of people that have joined the fight. The fights on Earth are filled with destruction and the fallout of everything that's gone on around them, and there's just so much going on in every single panel. It kind of made me realise why they needed 4 artists for this. Additionally, a lot of the quieter, more emotionally charged moments, especially the Batman one in the final issue, was still given enough time to highlight the intricacies of what he must have felt during that scene. There are other examples that I can think of involving the Earth 2 Superman, but that would just be straight up spoilers and I don't want to ruin those parts. However, and it was a complaint that I had with the original Crisis, but some of the pages are just too messy, to the point where I didn't fully know what was going on. I could still follow the story that was happening, which admittedly sometimes I can struggle with because, well, I'm a dumb reader, but especially in the pages where all of the planets are colliding, it just looked like stock photos of Earth that they've just overlapped with one another. And I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing, but those are some of the only times in this book that I was pulled out of it. On top of that, I'm not sure if this is an art or a script thing, but the layout of the dialogue itself could make it really easy to just get lost in a conversation, but not in the good way. There just wouldn't be a logical flow to the placement of the speech bubbles on some of the pages, and I'd end up reading them out of order. And don't get me wrong, that's not me blaming the omnibus, it's not because there's any kind of gutter loss going on or anything like that, and you should find a way to get your hands on this regardless of where you're located. Like for example, if you're in the EU and you want free shipping and gifts with every order, then the only place that you need to go is Comics Bugle. The prices are already great, but if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get 3% off all items that aren't already in a sale. However, whilst I'm speaking on the dialogue, I have to give it respect for being able to oversimplify stuff like the multiverse, but not in a way that makes it feel less important or less impressive. And also the way this managed to give a recap on Crisis on Infinite Earths, and also what's happened in the DC universe since then, I just felt was handled really well. In a way, it illustrated how to do that in the most efficient manner without ever boring the reader or leaving them to feel like they don't know enough. It did that really well from the beginning, but one thing I think it would have benefited from earlier on is establishing a central villain. It's even more confusing because they very easily could have put that role on the Secret Society of Supervillains, but they were more just a backdrop to some of the other events that were going on within the world, which makes me wonder what was the point in following them for 6 issues in the beginning. It's only about halfway through that the true villain really announces himself, and their turn is really understandable when they explain it, but it just feels really sudden, almost as if Johns realised halfway through that something was missing and just took the most obvious option. And that's the one clear thing where the original Crisis really one-ups this event, because the Anti-Monitor had that oh shit presence from the first moment that you saw him. So it's just a bit disappointing that the more intelligent one of the main villains just didn't really have that same presence. And even in saying that, I might not have liked his character as much, but I really liked the way that his plan unfolded, because it was done so in a way that connected all of those Prelude events, so even the ones that I didn't really enjoy too much now had a real place within the story. And it's just really great when you get to see Geoff Johns tie all those things together. Now, I'm not going to do a full spoiler section, but I am going to talk about Superboy Prime. And if you somehow haven't seen him since Infinite Crisis, and you don't know that he turns into an absolute murder machine by the end of this, well, sorry. Now you do. And if he hadn't, I don't know what the climax of this book would have been. That other villain that I just spoke about didn't really have that physical threat that would make the entire DC universe rally together to defeat him. It would have been really easy, just punch him in the face once. Tying it back into that sense of scale as well, this really felt like the epitome of an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. I also love the levels that they add to this final battle. Anyone who can fly, just go to space. And if you can't, fight on the streets. It felt like all of the build-up had been culminating to this moment. And I can't think of many other events where the final battle didn't just feel really forced, really rushed, or just a letdown altogether, but somehow Infinite Crisis managed to avoid all of that. I think it's clear that I had a great time whilst I was reading this, and if I sat here and spoke about absolutely everything that I loved, this would probably be like a 2-hour video. But the last thing that I want to give some respect to is when the Earth 2 characters were speaking about how much the DC universe has changed. I laughed out loud when they chalked up the insanity of the 90s and everything that happened there is just a result of the Earths colliding in Crisis on Infinite Earths, because it was somehow both a plausible explanation, but it also poked a little bit of fun of what's happened in the past. This is my final verdict. And what is the purpose of an event? Is it more important to set the stage for what's coming up for a comic company, or is it more so about being entertained? Well, whichever side of that argument you land on, Infinite Crisis is a prime example of how to do it right. The majority of the tie-ins are great and actually serve a purpose. It deals with massive concepts in a way that's digestible, and there's this constant sense that a key change is inevitable. Sure, there are a few plot points that feel crammed in there, and not all of the Prelude was created equally, but if you just skim read the tie-ins that you don't really gravitate towards and make it to the main event, it will be one of the most satisfying payoffs that you can experience in comics. There's a variety of top artists working on this, blending both the styles of earlier years and the modern era in a seamless way that gives Infinite Crisis this unique look. Characters are born, others die, and the same goes for worlds as well. And I've said it before, especially with events, that I wish I could have been reading comics at the time when it was first released, but that's mostly so I can appreciate elements that haven't aged as well. However, for Infinite Crisis, I just wish I could have been following comics to experience this event as it went on. I feel like I can confidently say that with just a little bit of knowledge, Infinite Crisis would still be entertaining to somebody who's getting into comics today, and that's even more impressive when you consider the big shoes that it had to fill with Crisis on Infinite Earths. It deserves its place in history as one of the most important, but also just one of the best DC events, and if I did have to sum up Infinite Crisis in one sentence, stop whatever it is that you're reading, strap in, and make sure you enjoy everything that this book has to offer. So that's a review, and hopefully you enjoyed it, but until next time, just make sure that you stay safe, and stay mad all you dogs. Woof woof! See you at the next video.